I knew something would change the minute my foot hit that cracked walk. Marsha's hands smelled like the store's flour and the green simmer of Sunday pot, and Malcolm's sneakers sat on the porch like a small, honest claim. I said we were home because saying it made it possible, and because saying it kept the kids from asking the hard question, are we staying? The house carried church in its bones, hymn-soft afternoons, sun pulling varnish warm, Marsha umming at the sink. But when I set my palm on the living room wall, what met my skin wasn't the warm give of old plaster. It was a tightness, a resistance as deliberate as a closed mouth. I have lived portable, barracks, rentals, the rented calm of borrowed rooms. Leonard left us this brick house and a key, and that key felt like a mission. Ownership should have felt like victory. Instead, it landed like obligation. Keep it, protect it, prove you belong. Cicadas buzzed low beyond the fence. The air smelled of cut grass and slow-frying onion. The kids assigned rooms with the quick certainty of small generals. Marsha's laugh lit the kitchen, a small lighthouse. Still, every time I crossed the living room, I felt the same small electric doubt, the sense the house remembers someone else's rules. After dinner, I went back with a flashlight and a patience that wouldn't quit. The paneling stayed mute. My fingers found a nail head, and I turned my knuckles white. Pride sat beside a hollow unease, like two old men sharing the same bench, neither speaking but both counting losses. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard nothing obvious, only the distant hymn from the steeple and the soft scrape of a neighbor locking up. But the board gave me no comfort. Under my palm, I felt the vibration, a faint, patient hum, like something breathing on the other side. It was not the house settling, it was intention. I thought of Leonard then, the way he folded his life tight, the small rituals he kept hidden. Taking this house meant taking that folded history with it. I could leave the wall be and keep the quiet, or I could pry. That night, the air tasted faintly of iron when I tried to sleep. Even then, my breath felt like paperwork. The panel did not give. The house would make me prove it.
The house learned our routines fast. Days spread out like rugs, Marsha cooking on slow afternoons, the kids carving rooms with whispered complaints, me going through cupboards with the polite suspicion of a man who knows he's always one step from being asked to move again. The old floors creaked differently under our steps, but they creaked steady and honest, and for a while that was enough. Still, the itch under my skin wouldn't go away. Small things kept pulling at it. A stud that met hammer like iron instead of hollow air. A picture hung that sat oddly flat against the wall. I told myself it was renovation work. Leonard had been careful, sometimes religiously so. But the carefulness read like a language I didn't know. You learn, as a man, to ask practical questions quietly. When a nail met resistance where there should be nothing, your first thought is mechanics, not malice. I stood on a ladder with a frame in my hand and drove a nail. The head bounced like a ball off a tile. Underneath, instead of the empty space I expected, something answered back, thick and black, like oil in the mouth of a pipe. The sound that came up from the strike, duller than wood, a low hollow, made my palms sweat. Inside the house the air tasted of old coffee grounds and something colder, metallic and patient. The kids were at the table, drawing maps of the house with crayon. Malcolm hummed the same bar of a hymn over and over, a small drum beneath their play. Marsha wiped a plate and watched me, and I watched her watch me. Curiosity and fear folded together until I couldn't tell which one was doing the pulling. If it was merely odd wiring, I could call an electrician. If it was something worse, If Leonard had been hiding more than stamps and old letters, then every strike of my hammer might uncap a history that belonged to more than us. I decided, finally, to stop being polite. I took the hammer and started to make the living room mine the only way I knew how, with my hands. Each board I pried away felt like an answered question and an accusation. Dust rose, a dry, old smell that pinched at my eyes. The taste of the dust sat on my tongue like a memory. Repair became investigation. I began to listen for patterns, the way the wiring ran, the neatness of a cut, the regularity of bolts. Whatever was behind those walls was not accidental. It was hidden with intention, like the careful folding of a letter before the envelope is licked. When I split a board, something dark and thick answered back. It rolled past my boot like a shadow of a thing that didn't belong to the house's ordinary bones. The kids asked from the stairs what I had found. I swallowed and told them nothing. Outside, the sun dropped. The house pulled the curtains closed in amber light. I propped the hammer against the frame and breathed the house's dust into my lungs like taking testimony. Whatever was in those walls had been waiting a long time, and now it woke for me.
It looked like old wiring at first. A heavy, black cable coiled tight behind the torn paneling. The kind of industrial rope you'd expect in a factory, not a family room. The dust had gathered on it in clear bands, like years marked on a ruler. My hands shook the way they did when a neighbor took a ledger out of reach. A soldier's suspicion surfaced before I let it. The cable didn't vanish in a stud or terminate in an outlet. It traveled, deliberate and cold, along the wall, snaking down into a baseboard and reappearing in a vent. I followed it with the flashlight's thin cone, heart beating against my ribs with a certainty that wasn't fear exactly, more like a trained awareness, mapping something that might be a threat. The afternoon light came through the blinds and slapped, warm and theatrical. Sawdust made tiny constellations in the beam. The kids watched from the stair rail, faces half intrigued, half afraid, and Marsha stood at the kitchen doorway, flower still on her sleeve, but her face serious. I felt that old soldier's economy. Observe, catalog, proceed. I traced the cable beneath the floorboards and found it ran along joists, disappeared into the basement and resurfaced in the attic. Every reappearance felt like an answer to a question I hadn't known how to ask. The heavy black braided jacket of the cable wore no labels, no electrician's tape. Whoever had put it there had wanted it to disappear into the house's structure. In my mouth, the metallic taste returned. The living room had become a body with veins I hadn't seen before. I thought of Leonard moving through these rooms, the way he kept to certain paths, how he would close doors behind him with the soft sound of someone who didn't want to be followed. Had he known? Had he helped? The thought made my hands cold. I tried to imagine the bureaucracy that designs things like this, institutions that wrap curiosity in cables and then tuck them away in people's homes. But my mind kept returning to the simplicity of it. Secret, kept in the ribs of a house. The cable wasn't a relic of antique renovation. It was something recent, patient and purposeful. I followed it downstairs, the beam of the flashlight trembling. Where it dove beneath the floor, it seemed to hum with a life of its own, as if information moved along it like blood. The house made no sound but for the slow, pipe voice of the refrigerator upstairs and the distant bark of a dog 2 houses down. But I could feel the wiring like a presence. It struck me then, with the clinical clarity of a soldier noticing an ambush, that this wasn't random. It had been placed. And whoever placed it had a reason that ran beyond Leonard's quiet eccentricities. The cable breathed into the floor like a hidden vein, and I felt the floorboard under my feet like a skin that had been pierced. We started playing detective in the margins. Nights filled with small discoveries, metal brackets behind vents, neat circular cutouts and foundation blocks, screws that weren't the kind you'd find in mom-and-pop repairs. My flashlight became a map, the house a puzzle that refused to be pretty. Sometimes the work felt absurdly domestic. I would cup a vent with the palm of my hand and smell the house's old stew of oil and laundry soap. Once, while dusting a patch of crown molding, I found a faint ring of grease where something had once been bolted tight. The ordinary objects of homemaking, jars, a thrifted lamp, a hymn book, now felt like camouflage. Leonard had been a private man. Stories stayed folded in the hem of his sleeves. I remember him sitting at the kitchen table, fingers stained with engine oil, smiling at nothing and everything. He left notes scrawled in a handwriting that bent in on itself, sometimes a receipt, sometimes a list. We read them the way we read scripture, looking for commands. The basement had always been a place you passed through. The old washer, a stack of cans, a rusted lawnmower. But behind a wire rack and a curtain of spider silk, I found a flush steel door. Dust pooled at its seam. When I brushed it away, the metal looked darker, like a mouth that had never been opened. My hands went cold. The flashlight beam trembled. I could hear my breath in the tightness of the concrete. Above me, the house settled with the gentle creak of a place that has been lived in for a long time. But the door against my palm felt like an accusation. I thought of the fold of secrecy that keeps families, especially black families, safe by habit. We keep some things quiet because the world outside is loud and hungry. But this felt different. This felt engineered. It felt as if some outside order had found its way inside and built a room for its own business. I told nobody at first. I took the key to the door and fitted it to my teeth for the stubbornness of it, not to bite, but to steady myself. The key turned with a quiet compliance. When the door sighed, it made the sound of an old man waking. Behind the steel threshold was a hum, low and mechanical, the hush of something that wasn't supposed to be in a basement of a family house. The light in the small chamber was an indifferent, clinical white that pooled off metal. The smell was of dust and machine oil, and beneath that another scent I couldn't name at first. The phantom of other people's voices. I leaned in, listening. The house had kept its secret long enough. Now, with a simple push, the basement door opened onto something humming.
The chamber looked like a shop, you see, at the edge of a factory. Bolted metal, panels, conduit. There were old jars of screws, a child's sock, and in the center, secured like a heart, a bolted metal box fed by every black cord we had found. The lights along its rack blinked with the indifferent rhythm of something recording time. The air was damp and smelled of grease. My hands left clean lines in the dust on the lid. I moved like a man who's practiced keeping calm under pressure. Training folds into the marrow. But inside I felt a gale of nausea, like the sea turning under a boat. When I pried the box open, rows of hard drives winked up at me, small silver stars in a dark sky, each labeled in Leonard's precise script. The labels were not the sort you'd find on a hobbyist's backup. They had dates, cell identifiers, abbreviations that read like bureaucracy. I felt the room tilt. Live drives, storage, a recorder. The realization landed with the weight of a verdict. These were not the little oddities of a hoarder. They were cataloged memory. Minutes and hours captured and saved. My stomach dropped, tasting the rancidness of betrayal. Marsha's footsteps were behind me before I heard them, soft on the concrete. She asked simply, "What is it?" And that one small question did something that years of my solitude hadn't. There was no way to tell her she was wrong about safety, not tonight. I thought about the intimacy of sleeping under one roof and the violence of it being watched. Homes are supposed to be places where your children can be clumsy, and your voice can curl into laughter without a ledger tallying it. To find cameras records in the heart of our basement was to find that someone had tunneled through that promise. I wanted to tear the drives out with bare hands, to flatten them, to destroy the evidence and the shame. But soldiers know the weight of evidence. Once you destroy it, you lose a claim. If this was institutional, destroying the drives might only feed a bigger erasure. Also, would that protect us? Would it make us complicit in hiding what had been done to others? Leonard's handwriting on the labels felt like a betrayal scrawled in a brother's voice. Had he built this? Had he been paid? Had he been coerced? The questions were hammer blows without answers. The room hummed as if waiting on me to make a choice. The hard drive spun softly, blinking like trapped memories. I rested my forehead on the metal and felt the pulse of a household turned into evidence.
That night, the kitchen table became an altar of paper. Leonard's notes were orderly. Dates, times, short acronyms, maintenance logs that read like the careful record of a man who understood the language of systems. On the page, he had mapped rooms like territories. He had logged checks and clear marks. Each entry tightened my chest. I ran my fingers over his handwriting and felt the thin line of anger. Leonard had carried secrets like a man carrying tools. Practical, necessary in his mind. Quiet. But the ledger made the secret mechanical. Routine checks, updates, firmware notes. It read less like eccentricity and more like compliance. On the counter, a neighbor called out questions over her fence, the kind that could be warm or venom. Mrs. Henderson, who'd known Leonard 50 years, stopped by with a pie and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She mentioned casually, "Marsha, you were singing the other day. Such a voice." Her tone was normal, but something in the way she looked at me felt like confirmation. I turned over a sheet and found an entry for the date Marsha had been practicing in the kitchen, with a note that said, "Audio check, kitchen mic active." My hands went cold. It wasn't just surveillance. It had been tuned to the rhythms of our lives. How do you tell your wife that someone had been cataloging her hums? How do you explain to your children that the silly dances you thought you did in privacy had been observed? I sat there while the kettle hissed and scalded my thoughts with the steam. My instinct was to protect, to hide this from them and keep the harm from spreading. But hiding felt like erasing what had happened. There was a cultural seam to this, how we keep things quiet because speaking up can be worse. Black families learn to fold their troubles inward because the public square historically does not offer recompense without cost. I understood that silence could be survival. I also understood that silence could be consent. Anger and sorrow sharpened in me until I could not tell which was which. I thought about Leonard's name inked on the drives and on the notes. If he had been making these entries, was he protecting us? Protecting whom? Had he been told he was doing work that would keep the neighborhood safe? The ledger didn't say. My private dread spilled out when I saw the neighbors smile with that small, certain knowing. The house that had given us shelter had also become a witness, and witnesses, once found, insist on being answered. When I looked up, Marsha's voice had gone quiet. She stood in the frame of the doorway holding a plate, eyes wide and steady, and I couldn't find the words that would not break either of us. The neighbor's smile collapsed whatever excuses I had left.
The neighborhood felt different after that. It's amazing how quickly normal life can rearrange to suit a new reality. People who once waved now lingered with a caution that looked a lot like surveillance. Cars appeared where they'd never parked before. A tailing sedan took a slow circuit a few blocks over. Mrs. Henderson's gossip stopped being small talk and became a language of nods and looks. My sleep frayed into mornings where I checked windows before the coffee finished. Every scrape on the street made my heart climb. The kids kept their voices tighter. Malcolm's humming dropped into short fits. The house that had promised rest now held a tension that moved through its walls. Reporting felt like a coin with two faces. On one side, there were official channels, police, reports, paper that promised action. On the other, we had the history, how institutions can be both remedy and predator. I sat on that coin, feeling its edges. I watched patterns form in the corners of my life. Strangers at corners, cars that left too quickly, delivery men who asked oddly specific questions about Leonard. Sometimes it felt like a play we had been cast in without auditioning. Other times, it felt like the inevitable consequence of pulling at something threaded through our home. I told Marsha because keeping it from her had become violence. She put the removed camera lens on the kitchen table like a relic and stared at it. Her hands trembled, not from fear only, but from the scale of the betrayal. Our family had to reckon together now. This was no longer a solitary cross to carry. We made a choice to call someone. Not the first people who arrive in uniforms, but a lawyer a friend recommended. A woman who had worked on cases where privacy and power tangled. Her office smelled like paper and mint. She listened with the patience of someone who'd read too many stories like ours. Then, the night the sirens came, they were not the cinematic kind. They were the low, practical chorus of things finally moving. Lights washed the yard blue, and uniforms stepped across the grass in careful, bureaucratic choreography. The family clustered where light didn't reach, holding each other like argument and armament. As officers moved through rooms, the house breathed differently. Exposed, stripped, relieved. Neighbors watched from porches with faces I couldn't decode. The sirens cut through the night and flooded the porch in color. I set my jaw and watched them pass through my house like harvesters. And somewhere in that light, I understood the neighborhood had always been an audience.
Morning looked like a headline. Reporters lined the street, cameras clicked. Officers boxed devices with gloved hands, cataloging serial numbers as if that alone could stitch what had been torn. The house stood patient while they carried pieces out, every drive wrapped and numbered. People said sorry in the same measured voice institutions use when they cannot fix what is intimate. They promised investigations, chain of custody, ongoing. Words that felt like form letters against our kitchen table where children's drawings still lay. The rooms were exposed. Brackets, conduits, the hollow spaces where machines had been. The lavender in the closet was gone, replaced by a thin smell of machine oil. We sat close at dawn, and the house felt both less and more ours, stripped of its secrets, but marked by them. The drives would not return a child's untamed laughter, were the privacy that had been taken. Ownership couldn't magically restore what the recording had stolen, a fabric of trust that had been worn threadbare. Repair would not just be a paint job, it would be a deliberate reclaiming of daily life. We faced a choice: stay and do the slow work of reclaiming, or leave and preserve a smaller piece. I thought about Leonard, about the ways a man's secrecy can be both survival and betrayal. That ambivalence wasn't easy to hold.
Neighbors brought casseroles, started conversations with careful apologies, or avoided eye contact altogether. The church came through in small, steady ways. The children started to hum again, softer at first, then with more courage. Those minor recoveries felt like stitches. Legal promises were not the same as returning the private. The officials talked of logs and warrants. I listened for the part that said, "We will not let this happen again." The assurances were thin, but not meaningless. We filed reports, gave statements, and learned the procedural language of grievance. At dusk, I walked the rooms alone. My hand found the seam of the living room panel where I'd first felt resistance. The wood was cool and ordinary beneath my palm. The drives were gone, but the watching lived on in my memory, the sense of being observed in ordinary life. Rebuilding would start with small acts, naming what had been taken, sitting with the kids and teaching consent like a practice, choosing neighbors we could trust, and telling the truth when it helped. It would be slow, messy, and stubborn work. I stood on the porch until the sun thinned and felt the house settle around us. Ownership didn't return what had been stolen. But maybe, I thought, it gave us the chance to make the place into something that would not let watching be ordinary.